Hello, everyone. My name is Nadia, and I'm the founder of Pilateshanoi Studio and Teacher Training Center, and educator of the Pilates teacher training programs, Lolitaslegacyvietnam. Today's lecture I would like to dedicate to the pelvic floor health. And some of you may experience the clients with the questions, I have incontinence, what should I do? Or postpartum rehab, how should I work with the clients? Or you yourself might be the mom who just recently had a baby, or even you may had a baby a long time ago and still feel some discomforts around the pelvis area, maybe the lumbar spine pain, which is chronic, or sacrum pain, or any kind of pains related to the pelvic area, which you cannot address with anything you tried before. So it's just kind of, let's say, chronic pain. This lecture would be interested, I think, mostly for women. However, we know that the pelvic floor dysfunctions may happen to men as well. And there is a myth that only women might be interested in this and have dysfunction in this area. We know that even professional sports people, they may experience leaking, even though we think they are trained, they're strong, and all associated with it. So it's totally not related thing because many factors involved into the pelvic floor dysfunction. My personal interest was in this topic because I was teaching Pilates for a while, I was practicing yoga, and work with the abdominal viscera and pelvic floor was something which I was doing from the beginning of my yoga practice. And in Pilates, I've met new concepts about it and then how to, work with it. And then being a mother, I also was interested in good and healthy recovery after the delivery process. So this lecture I'm addressing mostly for women as well as for the professionals who is working with women and with postural correction and chronic pains maybe. And I have to tell you that this topic should be useful for everyone because the pelvic floor is, as any other part of our body, is something we can work with and we can improve our health addressing this area too. So before we begin the conversation about the pelvic floor, I have to bring up the idea that the body is connected. So there is nothing like the pelvic floor is separately, the abdominal muscles are something separate, and everything is not connected. And we have those muscles sitting here, and there is no relation to it. No. We will bring up the concepts here that everything is connected, and I will try to explain you the basic connections in a simple language. And if you are Pilates professional or any other movement professional, you can reach out for the more in-depth exploration with a certain type of literature. But right now, I will start the conversation with simple things. What we know about the pelvic floor. So I have here prepared the pelvis model. And we know, many people know that the pelvic floor muscles is here at the bottom of the pelvis. Some people know that it's not the one muscle, it's few muscles. Some people know it's layered muscles. And we may have dysfunctions here, like incontinence and some others. So there are certain things we know about the pelvic floor, and our knowledge is that basically it's here at the bottom. What we should do about it, if there is any problems, we should do Kegels. And most of the people will stop conversation or explanation at this level, which is fine too. At least we know there is muscles and we can do something about it. Also, we know some people, especially with the age, they may experience organ prolapse, which is already a medical condition and can have different stages. And many articles about how important to have the strong pelvic floor muscles and everything. And then we think simple, like, okay, muscle is weak, what should we do? So we go and we start to train it. And this is one of the myths about the effective rehab of the pelvic floor, because the Kegels would come the last, let's say, in the history of the proper rehab of those musculature. Before we begin diving deeper into the anatomy, into the function, I would like to bring up the idea, which when I heard this, it kind of made a lot of sense for me, and also bring up more understanding to the pelvic floor health and how to maintain it. So if we took into account the history of the human evolution, we have to recall the fact that a long time ago we were quadruped, and then our pelvic floor was actually not at the bottom, was not the floor, but it was actually the wall, the pelvic wall behind, and then we had the tail connected to it. So then when you're in this position, the function of the pelvic floor would be totally different from when you're upright, right? So let's look at the story when we are quadruped. So then the pelvic floor is behind, is like the wall. Then we have the tail. And tail is a movable structure, balancing structure, and it do a lot of things for the movement, right? Tail connected sacrum, coccyx, and then there is a movement inside. So now we don't have tail, right? But we have the coccyx and we have the sacrum. And basically, these bones, they are having still the movement called nutation and counter nutation. And also we have the movement of the hip bones or the iliums. And when we are walking, this is something which which actually happens in your pelvis. And this is an important fact to understand, that the movement here should be present. I'll explain later a little bit why, but for now, you have to recognize one thing. So we had been, as a human race, before upright, we have been developing for a long time in quadruped position. Then we became upright. And upright time is actually much shorter than the time in quadruped position. And the movement inside of the pelvis will be important for us in exploring the recovery and restoring the function of the pelvic floor. Now, if we look at the pelvic floor as a muscle, I would like to bring up the example of another muscle, which is simple for you to understand. Let's take biceps. Everyone knows where is it, right? This is the most famous muscle, let's say like quadriceps, for example. So we know the attachments of the biceps, we know the function, which is the main flexor of the arm. And if we need to strengthen it, so we sit and we start to do concentric movement of the biceps. And what we know also recently, that the studies shows that when you are doing the bicep action, actually it generates only the 60% of the forces which comes to the forearm. And the last 40%, we don't know where it disappears. So the science says that actually the 40% comes lower in stabilizing the wrist and in stabilizing the shoulder. So the biceps action actually does not finish only here in this part, right? So it actually helps to tighten the fascia around the forearm and stabilize the wrist, and can tighten the here up into the shoulder. So in a modern anatomy, or let's say real anatomy, we know that the muscle function is not that simple as only the two connections are being closer. So biceps is a flexor, but it has a lot more function in the body as a whole. Same we can apply to the pelvic floor. So let's also look at this thing. So for example, if you know that your biceps is weak, you go and sit and start to do the elbow flexion, right? And with the pelvic floor, the concept, with the simple thing is to do the same. Okay, let's tighten it if it's weak. But we have to take into attention some more things, or the fascial connections of the pelvic floor musculature. Fascially, the pelvic floor musculature has their connection to the external hip rotators. We don't have this model, the leg, but fascially there is a connection, and there are connections from muscle to muscle. So basically, knowing that, we know that the leg movement would be pull on the pelvic floor, stimulated to the stretching and contraction, and in a natural way to force the muscle to work. I like to tell about this concept. For example, if you have biceps immobilized, it's not moving either in contraction or in extension, so then the muscle is weakening. The same we can apply to the pelvic floor. If we don't have the natural stimuli of those tensions being pulled back and forth, we have the muscle weakening naturally. So which movements can lead to this? First, we have an effective pelvic mechanics. So we don't have a good notation, counter notation, and ilium movement. Second, we don't have a good hip movement, restricted for certain reasons. And then we don't have natural stimuli and pull on those muscles through the connections to the other muscles or the leg muscles to be fully functional. So this is the one thing. Now, if we dive deeper into the fascia, if you think about the pelvic floor, I would bring up the idea that this is the molecular visceral cavity. Pelvic floor sits here behind. On top you have diaphragm, you have abdominal wall, you have the lumbar muscles. So, and all this cavity is like a chamber of pressure. Fascially, it's all connected. Diaphragm, pelvic floor, transverses, lumbar region. And if we first look at the pelvic floor as a pressure chamber, you know that if this is the abdominal cavity, we have the pressure, we have the liquid inside, let's say, so the pressure would be equal on the all walls of this chamber. And it should not be like this image, like, just the circle. It's like the 3D ball, which has the equal pressure to every wall of this ball. So we always should have the same amount of pressure equal to every wall of this chamber. What if we would have less pressure if we would have, let's say, this is the abdominal wall, and we would have the less pressure here, the diaphragm, because it's tight, right? So then we naturally would have way more pressure down here to the pelvic floor. The same would refer to any other musculature within this pressure chamber, from the back, from the front. So the same principle. If you have changed pressure from one side, it will bring up more pressure to the other side. So this is one more thing to consider. Let's say we have the situation when we have tight diaphragm, less pressure here, but way more pressure at the pelvic floor. And maybe we have associated with this also the lumbar spine tightness. And what if we just try to pull the Kegels up, the pelvic floor muscles up with the Kegel exercises? That would be just totally ineffective and impossible to do because of the nature of physics of this pressure chamber. So this was the life-changing information for me when I started to search for the deeper understanding of the function of the pelvic floor. So this is what we have to take into account, that this is not something, isolated. It's all connected within the same chamber of pressure. One more thing I have to mention, that this was a very famous in Pilates world study of Polestar founder Dr. Brent Anderson, who was actually doing the ultrasound transabdominal to see what the cue tighten the pelvic floor up is doing to the people. And the participants of this study they were the Pilates teachers. So people who actually has to be pretty much aware of the pelvic floor and activate it correctly. And then this study showed that 60% of the participants, instead of activating the pelvic floor, they were doing the pressure of pelvic floor down. And this is something very amazing. So you might think that you are doing the Kegels, you are strengthening the pelvic floor muscles, but maybe actually do pushing the pelvic floor out, which is not what we want to do. And how to check it? Either you have to see the specialist for it, or to use special, equipment to test it, which is available, I think, in some countries in physiotherapy pelvic floor rehab units. But what we can do as the regular people who just practice Pilates and want to decrease their some symptoms of dysfunction and strengthen really the pelvic floor. So I'll just tell this a little bit later on. So we talked about these few things so far about the pelvic mechanics, about the connection of the fascia of the pelvic floor into the fascia of the hip rotators. Then we talk about the pressure chamber, about the fascial connectivity of the abdominal viscera. To summarize this, I have to tell that the function of the pelvic floor would be something to help to maintain this balanced pressure within the chamber and stabilize stabilize the intra-abdominal pressure. Also, we have to know that the pelvic floor is a part of the deep frontal line, according to an anatomy trains concept of Thomas Myers. And also, looking into this line, we may discover about the dysfunction of the pelvic floor. Namely, if someone has a flat feet, or flattened feet, not real flat, but just weakness of the feet. If you can see someone with, like a double chin, mouth kind of breathing, we can also, think about it. Weak adductors. Of course, the belly, which is popping out as well. So there are certain things we can look at when we look at the person with a postural assessment to consider that might be a problem to this deep frontal line and pelvic floor connections. When you work with people or you are having any questions to your pelvic floor function, first what you should address would be the hip mobility. you want to make sure that you have those hips mobile enough. Mobile doesn't mean big ranges of motion. It means normal range of motion is present in both hips. Then we want to look at the pelvic mechanics, and we want to see if we have a good notation, especially and counter notation of the sacrum. We want to address the chest mobility to make sure that also there is no present tightness of the diaphragm. We need to have a good diaphragm excursion, and those two diaphragms has to be balanced in between each other. So we would also look at the mechanics of breathing to see we have this nice 3D expansion of the rib cage. We can explore if there is any good movement of the pelvic floor and lower abdominal during inhalation phase, and if there is a good timing to the breathing. So this is also a big chapter to explore, and this is something we can address and can re-educate as well. And only at the end of this training we can start talk about the Kegels and concentric work. The topic is big, and but it should be addressed in the right way. So if someone has already tight pelvic floor because of there is not enough movement within the pelvis, so trying to to tighten it more is not a good idea. Still, the musculature will be dysfunctional and will not give any real strength to the person. What I can advise to people who start to work with this, so basically have a nice walks with the big steps when you can have those iliums moving well. And then the best thing you can do would be something like a deep squats, not the Kegels, definitely. If you're interested in this topic, I'm inviting everyone to the deeper exploration of it on our workshop coming in October this year, 2023, and it's like recurrent event. We're doing it once a year here in Hanoi, Vietnam. And if you have questions, please ask below the video, share with your friends, with the people who is interested in. And I think this is it. Here was Radionacheva Nadia from Pilates House Hanoi Studio, Pilates educator and bowing therapist. And I hope to see you more on our channel. Subscribe to our social media as well. We have a lot of information shared there. And hope to see you soon once live in Pilates House Hanoi Studio. Have a nice day. Bye.